In this video, we'll take a look at 6 games, each in one of the most played openings by the Queen of Chess, Judit Polgar, sneaking a peek at her highly aggressive playstyle and tremendous tactical ability. The first opponent is the Mr. Rogers of chess, Yasser Seirawan, and he starts d4. Polgar with the black pieces replies knight f6. White continues c4, and Polgar unveils her second favorite opening, g6, the King's Indian defense, which she has played 139 times throughout her career. With the King's Indian, black deliberately allows white control of the center with pawns, planning to attack it from the flanks and later to challenge it. White develops the knight to c3, looking to support the e4 advance, and black fianchettos the bishop, giving her king castling rights already. White's e4, taking a dominant stance in the center, is met by d6, preventing white from bulldozing down even further. After white's bishop d3 developing, black castles her king to safety, and white follows with knight e2, leaving the lane open for the f-pawn to advance, while preparing to castle as well. Polgar develops her knight to c6, planning a counterattack in the center. After white castles, she drops the knight to d7, bolstering her e5 advance, while clearing the path for the f-pawn. White develops his final minor piece with bishop e3 before black strikes with e5. Now white could gain space with d5, which is good, but black would have a clear plan to counterattack on the king's side. In wanting to avoid a sharp game, white drops the bishop back to d2 instead, opening his queen's eyes so that once black captures the pawn on d4, white has ample defense and the knight can safely recapture. Black jumps her knight from d to e5, attacking the pawn on c4, which white defends with bishop b3. Black persists with knight a5, adding an attacker, and white's only defense is queen e2. Polgar's c5 hounds the knight, who jumps to b5. Black hits again with a6, and the knight retreats to a3. Then black drops her knight back to c6, looking to make use of her newfound control over the d4 square. In anticipation of knight to d4, which would hit the queen, white sidesteps her majesty to d2, and black decides to instead develop her final minor piece with bishop e6. White slides his rook over to d1, adding a second attacker onto black's backward d6 pawn. And black ignores this altogether as her queen springs menacingly to h4, drawing near the enemy king. Now, this surely takes some careful consideration from white, but he bites the bullet and grabs the pawn on d6. Polgar responds with bishop e5, attacking the queen and the pawn on h2 a second time. White luckily has one move to survive, which is g3 counterattacking. Black's queen inches forward to the weakened h3 square, and white greedily grabs a second pawn on c5. Now b6 here is awfully close to trapping the queen, but the pawn would be undefended, so it could be captured. In light of this, black slides her rook over to b8, threatening to trap the queen for real. So white drops her knight back to c2, creating an evacuation square for the queen. Once b6 is played, the queen drops miserably to a3, where it will be a while before she is able to get back into the game. Now black wants to reroute her knight towards the king's side, but her bishop is in the way. Also, white's pieces, for the most part, are not doing much, except for that knight on c3, which is itching to jump to a dominant position on d5. So Polgar puts 2 and 2 together and snatches the knight on c3, not only removing white's best piece before it could even become his best piece, but clearing the square for the knight. Once white recaptures with the pawn, the black knight leaps to e5, salivating at the prospect of jumping onto f3. White, in a desperate bid to prevent this, retreats his knight to e1, defending that square. Black was also attacking the c-pawn multiple times, so she grabs that, returning her knight from the rim back into the action as it hits the white queen, who flees to c1. Polgar's threats don't stop there, as her knight goes to g4, threatening to take on h2 with the queen. White's only way to protect the pawn is knight f3, and black's other knight swings over to e5, trying to eliminate the defense. White succumbs and takes the knight, leaving the pawn undefended. Yet, Black doesn't even take it, instead recapturing the knight, understanding just how powerful her knight would be were it to land on f3, and white doesn't have any way to stop it from getting there. He tries f4, attacking the knight, while freeing up an escape square on f2 for his king. Black's entire plan culminates on this next move. Can you find the checkmate in 4? The black pieces surround the white king, and the move Polgar plays to finish him off is knight f3 check. The king cannot go to the corner because queen takes h2 would be checkmate. So he flees to f2. After black takes the pawn on h2 with check, white sees his inevitable fate and resigns. White only has 2 options. Going to f1 would result in bishop h3 checkmate. Otherwise, taking the knight would lead to an elegant end with bishop g4 sacrificing a second piece, and once the king would capture, queen h5 would be checkmate. The next opponent is women international master Annette Wagner-Michel, and Polgar with the white pieces starts e4. Black replies e5 before Polgar unleashes her secret weapon, f4 the king's gambit, an opening she's played 21 times and one with which she's had tons of success. The king's gambit is an incredibly aggressive opening in which white offers a pawn to weaken black's control over the center and consequently gain dominant control over it. Black replies with a counter gambit d5 in an attempt to completely open up the position and exploit white's kingside weaknesses. Polgar grabs the pawn on d5 and black takes on f4. White defends her pawn from the enemy queen's attack with bishop to c4, but this allows black to continue with queen h4 check, stealing away white's castling rights. Still, this would put the queen in a spot where she could become a target by white's knight. So black instead proceeds development with knight f6, adding an attacker to d5. White defends with knight c3, and black defends her pawn with bishop d6, while preparing to castle. After white brings out her knight, both sides castle their kings to safety. Then black challenges white's advanced pawn with c6, hoping for a capture so that she can develop her knight when recapturing. Polgar doesn't give any freebies, instead pushing her pawn to d4, controlling the center while opening her bishop. Black's b5 attacks white's bishop, trying to remove the defense of the d5 pawn, and while the bishop could drop to b3, it would be pointless because the pawn would next go to b4 to remove the knight's defense. So white drops the bishop to d3, and as expected, the pawn presses on as it hits the knight, who jumps to e4, hitting black's bishop and knight. Black exchanges knights, and the bishop recaptures, landing on e4 where it protects the pawn. Black thrusts forward with f5, attacking the bishop, and it returns to d3 before black captures on d5, going up a pawn. In return, white has a slight lead in development, and Polgar quickly tries to take advantage of this by breaking open the center with the explosive c4. Now black may have difficulty defending the pawn, so she just captures en passant before white uses the recently opened diagonal to activate her queen on b3, where she peers the enemy king. Black's pawn is also under attack, so she drops her bishop to c7, opening her queen's defense, and white recaptures the pawn on c3. Black's bishop a6 is an attempt to exchange off pieces to weaken white's attacking chances, but white just takes the bishop, luring the knight to a dim square on the rim after it recaptures. White follows with bishop a3, developing with tempo, and the rook, under attack, flees to f6. This last move, however, is a big mistake, and white has one and only one move to win the game. Can you find white's winning move? To find this move, one must notice that the black queen has one too many responsibilities. She's not only defending the d5 pawn, but also the e7 square, and the move Polgar plays to exploit this is bishop to e7. This attacks the queen and the rook, and the queen cannot capture the undefended bishop because it would leave the d5 pawn hanging, whose capture would come with a fork on the king and the rook. So black's queen evades the attack, but after white captures the rook going up the exchange, black resigns. Not only would she be down material, her kingside would be shattered after the recapture, and white would keep building up the pressure with a move like queen b7. Yasser Seirawan makes a return for game 3 and meets Polgar's e4 with c6, the Caro-Kann defense. White takes full control of the center with d4 before black challenges it with d5. Then white chooses to capture the pawn, and after black recaptures, Polgar strikes with c4, the Panov Botvinnik attack, an opening she has played 49 times. With the Panov Botvinnik attack, white will get rapid development, good control of the center, and kingside attacking chances, despite a potentially weak isolated d-pawn. Black proceeds with knight f6, supporting his pawn, and white adds pressure with knight to c3. After black's knight c6 developing, white brings out her bishop to g5, undermining black's defense of the d5 pawn. So black releases the tension, capturing the pawn on c4. Polgar immediately makes use of the freed up square, pushing her pawn to attack black's knight. It jumps to e5, after which white centralizes her queen with another attack on the knight. Black counters with h6, hitting the bishop, and white chooses to take the knight. After black captures the bishop, white develops her bishop while recapturing the c4 pawn, and material has become equal. Now white may want to jump the knight to b5, where it would coordinate with the queen on the frail c7 square. So black plays a6, taking b5 away from white's pieces. Still, this leaves g5 hanging, but white opts to castle long, which centralizes the rook and prioritizes piece activity over material. In response, black jumps his queen to d6, hoping for a queen exchange to diminish the effect of white's lead in development. Polgar proceeds activating more pieces with knight f3 defending her queen, and black replies with g4, saving the pawn while trying to remove the defense of the queen. White's next move is rook e1 with a sneaky threat. Were black to capture the knight, white could take the queen, and black wouldn't be able to recapture because of the pin on the pawn to the king. So black exchanges queens, and the white knight recaptures, landing on a powerful post on e5. Yet this leaves the h-pawn hanging, and the black rook rushes to capture it. White follows with d6, hoping for a capture so that the e-file is opened up, after which white would be able to move the knight, attacking and winning the black rook thanks to a discovered check on the king by the white rook. White's bishop has also been opened up, adding a second attacker onto f7. So black stops all threats with e6, blunting the file and the diagonal. White's next plan is to push her d-pawn, but the black knight defends that square. So Polgar jumps her knight to e4 in order to remove the knight. The black knight doesn't really have any good options either. Going to d7, for example, could allow white to take on f7, and once the king would recapture, white could jump the other knight to g5, which would win a second pawn on e6. White would follow by taking the bishop on f8, before she would swoop the rook onto the back rank, which would paralyze black's pieces. Back to the game. To avoid all of this, black just captures the knight, and the rook recaptures. Black should carry on with development here, but he decides to play f6, kicking the knight. This is a mistake, and Polgar is able to push d7, forking the king and the bishop. Black takes the pawn, and white recaptures with the knight, getting a piece for 2 pawns. After black's e5, white gives back the piece, capturing the pawn. Black recaptures, and white takes the pawn with his rook, restoring the material balance, but taking dominant control over the middle of the board. Black's only move here is to block the check on his king with bishop to e7. Polgar shifts her other rook onto the e-file, piling up on the pinned piece, and there is absolutely no way to defend the bishop. Black miserably castles his king long, and white snatches the bishop, gaining the upper hand. Black desperately grabs the pawn on g2, but white takes the g7 pawn. Black takes another pawn, and while white could do the same, she brings in her other rook, doubling up on the 7th rank with the intention of going after the enemy king. After black's b5 hitting the bishop, white has a way to finish the game off. Can you find white's checkmate in 5? The black king is confined to a slim 3 squares, and the first move Polgar plays to entrap him is bishop e6 check. Now black could block with the rook to delay things. White would take it, and black could get another move in with rook f1 check, after which white would block the check, while giving a discovered check with her bishop. The king would move, and white would take the rook, before jumping the rook to the back rank to give checkmate. Instead of all of this, black just slides his king over to b8. White's next move is rook to b7 check. The king goes to a8, then rook a7, king b8, and finally rook g to b7 checkmate. The fourth opponent is international master Leon Pliester, and he meets Polgar's e4 with c5, the Sicilian defense. White carries on with knight f3, and after d6, white lunges in the center with d4. Black captures the pawn and white recaptures, centralizing her knight. Knight f6 attacks e4, and knight c3 defends. Then black plays a6, the Najdorf, to which Polgar replies with f4, the Amsterdam variation. In meeting the Najdorf Sicilian with the Amsterdam variation, white is fighting for the e5 square and will often look to attack down the f-file. Black follows with knight b to d7, planning a central advance, and white's bishop e2 prepares to castle kingside. Then black strikes with e5. Polgar captures the pawn, creating a semi-open f-file which her rook will soon occupy. Black recaptures with the knight, landing it in the center, and white develops the bishop to g5, pinning the black knight to its queen. Black breaks the pin right away with bishop e7 while preparing to castle, and white develops her queen to d2. Then both sides castle their kings to safety. Black's h6 asks the question to the bishop, who retreats to e3, keeping an eye on the black king side. Black develops his final minor piece with bishop to e6 before white cautiously shifts her king to the cozy corner on h1. Black slides his rook to the semi-open c-file, and after white leaps her knight to f5, looking to potentially sacrifice a piece on h6 to break open the king side, black eliminates these possibilities altogether, chopping off the knight with the bishop. Polgar recaptures with the rook, keeping it on the semi-open f-file, where its partner can soon join it. Black shifts his rook to the semi-open e-file, where it indirectly attacks white's isolated e-pawn, before white swings her other rook over to f1, doubling up on the f-file. Now that white's pieces are in place, she is planning to capture twice on h6, which would kickstart a potent attack. The black knight would be under immense pressure, and it wouldn't be able to move because it would be pinned by the white rooks to the pawn behind it. White would follow by jumping her knight to d5, attacking the black knight, and things could get ugly. So black drops his knight to h7, planning to meet the double capture on h6 with bishop to g5, which would kick the queen away and ensure his king's safety. Still, this leaves the d5 square undefended, and Polgar's queen lands there, adding a third attacker onto f7. Black doesn't see much problem with this, as his knight defends that square. So he lifts his rook to c6 with an idea to double up along the c-file. Now white could unleash her attack by sacrificing the exchange on f7, but she decides to remain patient, dropping the queen to b3, where she maintains a fervent glare on the king. The b-pawn is also under attack, so black pushes b5, saving it. Then white hops her knight to a powerful post on d5. Black slides his queen to a8, and it appears that this move aims to pressure e4 and to defend the a6 pawn in anticipation of knight b4, which would fork the rook and the pawn. But moving the queen to a8 is a big mistake. Polgar grabs the pawn on f7, sacrificing a full rook as the knight recaptures. Then she grabs the knight, sacrificing the second rook to lure the king into the leering eyes of the white queen. White continues knight b6 with a discovered check and attack on the queen. Now black's position is beginning to fall apart. Were he to drop the king to f8, then white would not take the queen, but instead move the knight to d7 with checkmate. Another choice, like blocking the check with the rook, would just lose material. So black instead moves the king to g6, and white still has a spectacular way to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in 4? The black king is out in the open, naked and afraid, and the move Polgar plays to lure him towards his grim fate is bishop to h5 check. The king only has 2 moves. Going to f6 would result in knight to d7 checkmate. So the king accepts the sacrificed bishop, and you'd think, having given away so many of her pieces, white wouldn't have enough to finish the game off. But after queen f7 check, black has no choice but to resign the game. Black has a few options here. Blocking with g6 would lead to queen f3 check, and after king h4, queen h3 would be checkmate. Moving the king to g4 would also see queen f3 pushing the king to h4, where queen h3 would again be checkmate. Finally, going to h4 would end with g3, and it wouldn't matter where the king would go next, queen f5 would be checkmate. The penultimate opponent is women grandmaster Elisabetta Polironiade, and she starts e4. Polgar with the black pieces replies c5, the Sicilian defense, and white carries on with knight f3. After e6, white thrusts forward with d4. Black captures the pawn, and white recaptures with the knight. Then Polgar plays her third favorite opening, knight c6, the Taimanov Sicilian. In the Taimanov, black develops the knight to a natural square and keeps options open regarding the placement of other pieces. White develops her knight to c3, and black places the queen on c7, where she has more scope and prevents white's bishop from getting to f4. After white develops her bishop to e2, preparing to castle, black pushes a6, preventing white's knights from getting to b5 to ensure the security of her queen's position. Then white pushes f4, gaining a firm grasp over the center. Polgar takes this moment to capture the knight on c4, not only clearing the queen's vision down the file, but once white recaptures with the queen and black plays b5, we notice that the black bishop, who will soon land on b7, will also see further with the knight out of the way. White develops her bishop to e3, hinting at a queenside castle, and after black places her bishop on the long diagonal, white follows through with the long castle. Black slides her rook over to create a battery along the c-file with eyes on the enemy king, and black lifts her rook, not only defending her c2 pawn, but planning to triple up along the d-file. Polgar develops her knight to f6, adding another attacker to e4. So white defends with bishop f3. Black swings her queen over to a5, setting up potential tactics to remove the defense of the a2 pawn. White counters with e5, attacking the knight and opening the bishops to one another. Black counters the counter with bishop c5 hitting the queen. White drops her to d3, and black snatches the bishop behind. After white recaptures with the queen, black pushes b4, hitting the knight. This does leave the bishop hanging, however, and white takes that, before black gobbles up the knight on c3, while hitting the rook. Now white recapturing with the pawn would be dangerous because of the fragile pawn structure near the white king. So white lifts her rook to d3. Polgar inserts knight g4, advancing her knight into enemy lines with an attack on the queen. And white lets her go, capturing the pawn on c3. Black accepts the offer, taking the queen, and in return, white grabs the free rook on c8 with check. The king dodges, and white grabs the second rook, getting 2 rooks and a pawn for the queen. Yet white's king is about to be in big trouble, and it all starts with black's queen taking the pawn on a2. The queen's going to skewer the king and the rook, so white plays g3, opening the bishop's defense of the rook. From this point forward, we see the formidable duo of queen and knight work their magic, all led by the hands of a chess legend. Polgar leaps her knight to c4, adding an attacker to the b2 pawn. White cannot save the pawn because b3 would completely forget about queen a1, checkmate. So the king starts running to d1. Black's queen rushes to b1 with check, pushing the king forward to his only available square. Then black takes on c2 with another check, and were the king to go to the back rank, wouldn't matter which square, black would follow with an unstoppable mating combination of queen d2, followed by knight e3, and queen e1 checkmate. So the king continues its forward march. Black's queen b3 pushes the king to g4, and the knight leaps to e3 with check. After the king goes to h4, black grabs the bishop on b7 with an attack on the rook while going up 3 points of material. White saves a rook, and here black has a way to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in 7? Now, although this is a long checkmate, many of the moves are just white delaying things. The move Polgar starts with is queen f3, and white, knowing it's all over, resigns the game. This last move not only locks up the white king, but it threatens checkmate on g4. White would reply rook e8, buying herself one move. The king would capture, then white would play g4, allowing the rook to defend against the checkmate. Black would check on f2, which would force the rook to block, so that once black would take the pawn on h2 with check, white could block with the rook. Knight g2 check would be next, which would force the king away. Black would grab the rook, and white's following move would not matter. h6 would be checkmate. The final opponent is Grandmaster Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, and Polgar with the white pieces starts e4. Black replies e5, and white's knight f3 pressures the pawn, so knight c6 is played defending. Then Polgar plays bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez, her favorite opening and one she's used a staggering 237 times. White's third move attacks the knight that defends the e5 pawn from the attack by white's knight. Black replies a6, attacking the bishop, and we notice that although white could take the knight, after black recaptures with the d-pawn, white taking e5 would be met by queen d4, hitting the knight and winning back the pawn. Polgar calmly retreats the bishop, keeping an eye on the knight. Black plays knight f6, attacking e4, and white castles, so that once the knight takes the pawn, which is what happens, white can play d4 in an attempt to open the e-file before pinning the knight to its king. Black keeps his position solid, playing b5, pushing the bishop back to b3. This then allows him to play d5, guarding his knight, since his other knight no longer needs the defense. White grabs the pawn on e5, opening a second attacker, namely the queen, onto the d5 pawn. So black defends while developing with bishop to e6. White's knight to b to d2 challenges black's advanced knight, and black opts to save it by moving to c5, where it hits the white bishop. White continues c3, fighting for important squares in the position, and black challenges the pawn with d4, while opening the bishops to one another. White jumps her knight to g5, attacking the bishop, and black moves it to d5, hoping for white to capture it so that he can bring his queen out when recapturing. Polgar has different things in mind, as she stunningly sacrifices her knight on f7. Now, if the bishop captured the knight, then white would take the bishop, luring the king to f7, after which the white queen would jump to f3, forking the king and the knight, after which white would emerge up a pawn. So black bites the bullet and takes with the king. Queen f3 check comes next, making use of the pin on the bishop to the king. The bishop is under attack twice and only defended once, so black's only way to save face is to walk his king out into the wild on e6, where he hangs onto the bishop for dear life. Polgar lifts her queen to g4 with check, and the king returns to f7. The queen continues its advance onto f5 with another check, pushing the king to e7. Then white advances the pawn to e6, opening the queen's attack onto the bishop. Black's only choice is to take the pawn with his bishop, giving white a completely open e-file to work with. She immediately makes use of it, shifting her rook over to e1 to pin and attack the bishop for a third time. Black defends desperately with queen d6. Polgar snatches the bishop, forcing black to recapture with the knight, placing a new piece into the white rook's pin. Then white jumps her knight to e4, not only attacking the queen, but preparing to pile up on the pinned knight. Black's only move is queen e5, escaping the attack while begging for a queen exchange. White's bishop swoops into g5 with check, and black should not take the bishop because white would recapture with the knight, opening the rook's pin of the black queen onto her king. So black sidesteps his king to d7. Polgar jumps her knight to c5 with check, opening the rook's attack onto the queen. Black snatches the knight, and white doesn't even take the queen. She first moves her queen to f7 with check, so that were the king to retreat, she could take the queen, and once the knight would recapture, she could win the other knight too. For that reason, black moves his king forward to d6, defending his pieces. White checks with bishop e7 because were black to capture that bishop, then white would take the queen with the rook. Black wouldn't even be able to recapture because rook e1 check would force the king to one of two squares, and it wouldn't matter which it would choose. Queen takes e6 would be checkmate next. So black advances his king to d5, hoping he's held everything together. But soon after playing this move, he realizes that white has a fantastic way to win, and he resigns the game. Can you find white's checkmate in 3? The black king has strayed just a little too far, and the move Polgar would play to seal his fate would be queen f3 check. Dodging to c4 would be met by b3 checkmate. So the black queen would have to block. Then white would play c4 check, giving black a few options. Capturing with the pawn would take the square away from the king, so that queen takes e4 would be checkmate. Moving the king to e5 would also result in queen takes e4 checkmate. Finally, capturing the pawn with the king would end with queen b3 checkmate. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.